Well, good morning and welcome to today's SVDX webinar. My name is Nancy Easterbrook. I am Executive Director of SVDX. We are so pleased that you are joining us today on this Monday morning. Today's session will be on the board's appetite for risk. Plenty to talk about. Our session today will be 60 minutes in length, and we encourage you to submit your questions via the Q&A feature on Zoom. Please do so throughout today's webinar. We will do our best to try and fold them in throughout today's conversation. And we will be recording today's webinar for future viewing on our website, and I will send out an email once that link is available. It's truly my pleasure to introduce today's set of panelists. I will do very brief introductions before we get started on today's webinar. Teresa Bryce Bazemore has over 30 years experience as a senior executive in the banking and mortgage banking fields, including building both mortgage insurance and services businesses. Teresa was most recently president and CEO of the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco. She previously served as the president of Radian Guarantee, and prior to that was the EVP, General Counsel, Corporate Secretary, and Chief Risk Officer at Radian Group. She is currently the CEO of Bazemore Consulting, LLC. Amy Guggenheim-Schenken is an experienced public company and private equity-backed corporate director, public company officer, president, and former McKinsey & Company digital transformation leader. Amy's operating experience spans 30 years and includes leadership positions in industry powerhouses such as McKinsey & Company, GE, Wells Fargo, Travelocity, and Common Sense Media. Amy is also the newest SVDX board member, and we are thrilled to have her as part of the SVDX community. Elliot Sloan is founder and managing partner of Through Co Communications, where he leads the firm's financial, corporate, transactions, and crisis practices, leading programs for Teladoc Health, the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco, Lightyear Capital, and United Therapeutics. Throughout his career, Elliot has provided strategic counsel to some of the world's most notable organizations, often on the front lines with executive teams and boards, helping them to manage through complex and difficult situations. Our moderator for today, Dan Siciliano, is a successful technology CEO founder and entrepreneur and recognized expert in corporate strategy and governance. He is chair of the board of the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco and currently chairman of SVDX, board member of the Latino Corporate Directors Education Foundation, chair of the Council of Federal Home Loan Banks, and a fellow at Stanford University. Thank you again to Elliot, Amy, and Teresa for joining us today, and thanks to all of you for participating in today's webinar. Dan, off to you.
Great, thanks very much, Nancy. So the challenge, of course, with talking about risk is that there is so much content on risk, right? So risk in every possible way for directors. And so I hope that what we can manage to do is kind of cleverly thread our way into the more interesting topics. And so bear with us as we ask some obvious and not so obvious questions to our panelists and draw on their different backgrounds and experience, including Elliot, who tends to be the guy you call when the risk that you took didn't go the way you hoped. And we'll talk about a little bit of what we can learn from the practical planning side from him. But I think I do want to start out with kind of a broad observation and then ask a question that's kind of sets a framework. And that is, it feels like to directors that the lens of risk, the aperture has opened even wider. So companies that would not particularly pay attention to geopolitical concerns now have that to some extent, at least on their radar screen. Many did front and center, but now many more do. Increasingly, there is an issue of social, political, domestic risk in many different forms, which tends to pop up on people's screens now more than ever. And so it feels like there's a lot more risk bouncing around. And so one of the questions that's behind the scenes for all of us as you answer the other questions is maybe to reflect on whether or not you think this is real. Is there actually a more fraught environment? Does it apply to everybody? Is there a way to parse it without becoming overwhelmed? Or is it just an impression that every generation has at a moment in time, given any year or decade that you say, oh, it's worse than it's ever been? So I'd be interested in you kind of throwing that out there as we walk through that. But here's the kind of framing question. We talk about risk tolerance and we talk about a risk tolerance framework. And these are very generic words. And I wondered, Teresa and Amy, you can go in either order, whatever you like. Can you just tell us what that means to you in the boards that you've served on? So what does it mean when someone says, oh, what's your risk tolerance framework? What does that actually mean, both practically and theoretically, if you like?
Teresa, do you want to go or you want me to go?
You can start and
Okay.
I'll follow.
Well, thank you for that. Thanks, Dan. I think about it not as specifically risk tolerance framework, but more as a risk framework overall. Given that I spent a lot of time at McKinsey, I tend to love frameworks. And I think that the reason why is a good risk framework allows you to think in a comprehensive and methodical way about risk, which is why I think it's so important in the boardroom. There is the risk that is inherent in every strategy that's extremely important to talk about. Probably not, every meeting, but certainly when the board is talking about strategy. And then there's the specific risks that are taken on and needed to not be taken on as you go forward and try and execute on that strategy. And those risks actually are things that you probably should be talking about at every board meeting. So to me, a great framework provides the basis for a comprehensive discussion that hopefully enables you to not miss out on things.
Great. That's great. Teresa?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think about it as sort of enterprise risk, right? Enterprise risk framework where you're thinking about the myriad of risks. There tends to be a focus on operational risk, for instance, or liquidity risk, but also thinking about reputational risk and, the other types of risk. You mentioned geopolitical. I think every board should be thinking about, is there an impact? It's going to depend on the business. It's going to depend on whether you're a national or an international business, those kinds of things. But each board should be sort of categorizing those and understanding sort of the level of risk they pose in general, and understand on a periodic basis whether that risk is increasing or decreasing, right? So that you can understand where to spend your attention, where to look for management to tell you how they're addressing those issues. And so I think having that framework, to Amy's point, in place so that you can understand where you should focus your attention is important.
Great. And let me highlight a couple commonalities in what you've said. So it feels like one of the goals that a board should have is engagement on issues of risk for purposes of both understanding what can happen, what can go wrong, but also as a part of navigating strategy and execution. These are obviously overlapping concepts, but the frameworks, whether you focus on operational or other, or if you do it a little bit over time or you revisit it in a big way once a year, it seems like, and this is maybe one of the key takeaways that we'll keep coming back to, it seems like this is a tool so that the board can engage affirmatively and ask questions about taking risks, avoiding risks, mitigating risks. So it's not as simple, we might be a victim of a bad thing and how do we defend ourselves? It is much more strategic than that. And I think that's kind of one of the big themes, is that boards that are great at risk are great at weaving it into strategy and making it a part of what they think about affirmatively. So
I think that's right. I think that's right, Dan. And I think it also, and we saw this, I think, more and more in the financial crisis, right? Where you started to think more about scenario planning and not just strategic planning, right? So to say, here's a strategy that we have. What are the things that could happen that would cause us to think differently about how we proceed on this strategy, and how do we monitor for those things in the future? And so I think that becomes part of this whole equation that a board needs to understand, and not just what the strategy is, but how you might have to pivot from that strategy.
So let me ask a follow-up question, but I'll frame it. And we haven't heard this recently because, the great financial crisis has faded, maybe not from memory, but at least, in time. But, during and immediately after, you had a lot of often policymakers would say things like, we must never allow a large public company to fail again. There must never be, fill in the blank type of industrial company or bank or financial company to ever fail. And of course, as kind of a recovering academic economist, this is a terrible idea. I think what people mean to say is you don't want companies or enterprises to fail for the wrong reasons, right? So business is hard, it's risky, it's challenging. There are winners and losers, but there are some things that you don't want to get wrong because you could have avoided it and that'd be a problem. So with that as kind of the background, there's this broad risk aversion, especially during times of difficult crisis and otherwise. And I think directors, as responsible, successful people, tend to be actually somewhat risk averse on average. The exception makes the rule. You have certain CEOs who are risk loving and risk taking, but I think you have boards that are careful, thoughtful people. Can you talk to me about the difference between individual risk preferences as manifest by board members when they arrive on the board versus a board or enterprise risk framework and ultimately risk tolerance? These are clearly different things, but I'm curious if you could talk about how they kind of show up at the boardroom and how boards can navigate the difference between someone being very risk averse versus the enterprise deciding on a course which may be risky in some ways and somewhat risky in other ways and very risk averse in other ways, much more nuanced than an individual. Can you talk about how that shows up? Maybe Teresa, you've been on boards in the middle and also the head of companies in the middle of really difficult financial crises, and they were financial companies. So maybe you could talk about that a little bit, and then I'll switch to Amy, and then we're going to pull Elliot.
Yeah, so I think part of the issue is that, when policymakers are saying, hey, we should never have this happen, you can also be so risk adverse that you're not capitalizing on opportunities, you're not moving the business forward, you're not making the gains that you could be making in a very reasonable manner without taking on untoward risk. And so I think you also have to understand where also risk aversion could in fact create a situation where you're making the situation worse than it would otherwise be. So I think understanding where different folks are in the boardroom, helping them understand sort of what a reasonable way to move forward is, and asking those questions of management, sort of what are the different ways that we can move forward on this, and what are the risks associated with it? How do we mitigate those risks? But also, if we sort of try to have no risk, which is almost impossible, right? Are there any sort of negative consequences to doing that? And think about it in that way, and have a robust discussion about that.
And so I'll come, Amy, I'd love you to chime in on this, but I do want to pin something you highlighted, Teresa, and we'll come back to it hopefully, and I would encourage questions about it. This idea of what is the risk of doing nothing, or what is the risk of not taking the bold move, or what is the outcome scenarios risks of not doing the risky thing, for lack of a better phrase. So that discussion it's a little awkward, right? It seems like an odd discussion, but I know it is one that's important to really flesh out future scenarios. I'd like to come back to that, about how to have that constructive conversation in a meaningful way on a board, and how you can set management up to do that well, and how that back and forth between board and management works. But Amy, can you talk a little bit about how on your boards and in your experience, even with your McKinsey history, how you translate individual preferences into the right combination of enterprise risk-taking and risk preferences?
Yeah, well, I agree with what Teresa said. And, I have two thoughts on that. One is that, and this is part of what Teresa was saying, you have to have explicit conversations about risk and what your risk tolerance is and what the assumptions are in it. And are we taking enough? Are we not taking enough? And a few months ago, I wrote an article for directors and board, the website, on taking on risk. And maybe in some ways I wrote it for myself, because I've found myself, with everything that's going on in the world, more focused on protecting against downside risk than thinking about how we take advantage of the upside risks. And I discovered when I was writing the article, I remembered I was an econ major in college, but there was two behavioral economists in the 70s that were talking about how people make decisions under uncertainty, and they found that losses have a greater emotional impact than a gain of the same amount. So I also think that we actually should also talk intentionally about all of us as human beings and how we might be biased more towards protecting against the downside than trying to think about how to take advantage of the upside. But the bottom line is, with either of those 2 points, is that we have to talk about it and just lay it out on the table about, this is how I'm thinking about it, this is where I'm coming from, and debate it and get to the right answer for the specific company in the specific point in time.
Great. Yeah, Amy, I liked in your article, I think you quoted Andy Grove's only the paranoid survive, which is great. And yet, of course, Andy Grove led Intel during a time where they took many substantial risks, right? They invested tremendous amounts of capital in things that they weren't sure the market was ready for or that they would succeed. That's the nature of R&D. And yet you can do that side by side with being paranoid about how to prepare for, mitigate against, have optionality around the risks you're taking. So you can do both. And
I'd argue you have to do both.
Yeah.
Right? If you're taking on big risks, you got to really think through what are the major things that could go wrong to prevent us from being successful in this endeavor, and how do we mitigate as many of those big things as we possibly can.
And Elliot, I'm about to cue you up with a question that's super practical about how boards react and management reacts when things go wrong, despite all the best efforts. But before I switch to that, I want to ask one more follow-up to Amy and Teresa, and that is, where is this happening in the boardroom? So, many financial institutions have risk committees, and so obviously it's starting and happening there to a certain extent, but a lot of boards don't have risk committees. So, Amy and Teresa, do you have a view or a preference about what committee should own the discussions of risk and how it should or should not, maybe, but how it should percolate to the board as a whole?
I have a strong view, and this is not answering for financial services companies, which may be different, but that it's owned by the entire board. To me, I always think about the 3 jobs of a board member or the board itself as, oversight of strategy, oversight of risk, which are completely intertwined, and then hiring, mentoring, and if needed, letting go the CEO. And, that's my sort of simple view of, what we do as board members. And so because of that, it's the job of the entire board, and the strategy is the job of the entire board. When you get into things like looking at legal and compliance risk or financial risk, it's going to fall more into the audit committee. If you look at risks of misaligned incentives based of compensation, that's going to fall into the comp committee. And so, the answer is it depends, but certainly as an aggregate, to me, it's the responsibility of the board.
Teresa, does that?
I would totally agree with that. I think the sort of understanding of the risk to the enterprise and sort of understanding that framework and what those risks look like, right? Are they increasing? Are they high? They're low, medium? I think the whole board should be engaged in that discussion. I also agree that there are going to be specific things like how's the liquidity looking, how that should be discussed in sort of a financial committee or an audit committee. What kind of compliance risk or regulatory risk that should probably, because you might need to get into more nuanced discussions or more granular discussions in those committees. That should also be reported out to the board, so the board should know kind of what the stance the committee is taking, and determine also, are there decisions that should be past the committee? In other words, elevated from the committee to the board. But the overall enterprise risk, to me, is a discussion for the board to have.
Great. And we'll come back to a question that was posed, but I think you've answered about half of it. And the question was, who serves up this conversation about risk? And it sounds like it's really both management and the board. At a practical level, the management, if they have a chief risk officer or the otherwise have history and they know the areas that are risky, will be bringing that to the board. But it sounds like, to your both of your points and themes, that the board, as an affirmative matter, must be drawing out management and engaging in discussion, and maybe not just relying on management's back and forth, but actually creating a strategic, macro vision about risk and the like. And maybe we'll come back to the tactical part about how that works inside a boardroom with management and how not to step on toes in your views. But first, Elliot, here's the question for you. And, there's all sorts of sayings that go something like, every great plan, no plan survives, the first engagement on the battlefield, it's all fine and well until you get punched in the face. There's all these different sayings that kind of basically explain the whole, you can talk about it, you can plan for it, you can know there's a 1 in 3 chance that the bad things are going to happen. And then the bad things happen, right? And my observation is that there's a full bell curve of both enterprise and board responses to bad things happening. The average board does okay, the average enterprise does okay, and they kind of work through it. There's a tail that kind of everyone freaks out and their hair's on fire, and you can kind of observe the problem underway. And then there seem to be boards and enterprises that bad things happen to them all the time, and yet they kind of seem to be smooth sailing. So my question for you, Elliot, is what are some characteristics that you find either on boards or management or both that kind of signal thoughtfulness and preparation to handle risk taking, strategic, guided by the board and but things do go wrong. No matter how hard you try, things go wrong. Maybe it was an execution error, maybe it was bad luck, maybe you got outcompeted, maybe the government changed the rules midway, maybe a cyber attack happened and it was state sponsored and there was no amount of preparation that could prepare. So what characterizes boards that are handling that better than boards that aren't, and or management? What do you see?
Thanks, Dan. And I just want to say I'm happy to be here and to be on with Teresa and Amy and to be part of this. I was thinking as the conversation was going on over the years, we've worked with a wide range of boards, right? So big public companies, AT&T, and then Silicon Valley startups, which have a whole different risk profile. And then I worked for Boone Pickens for a long time, this wildcatter from Texas, who ran a hedge fund, and he made and lost billions of dollars 3 or 4 times in his career. That guy he just embraced risk. It was part of his profile. So you think about the sort of swath of it. And to your question, what are the characteristics of organizations that deal with risk and then the sort of downside of making decisions or the unforeseen? And I think there are probably 3 things that come to mind. One is that there is the board's engaged throughout the whole thing, that they don't sort of wake up and at the quarterly board meeting, there's a presentation that says, oh, by the way, this is what's happening. And so recognizing that not every board can meet on a consistent basis and all that, but there needs to be some communication going on and some trust that the board is there not just to kind of rubber stamp the CEO's 3-year plan, but to be there because they have something to offer, and that they're there because they've got some experience in either the subject matter or the regulatory landscape. The second thing is, and sometimes we get, confused. Risk is crisis, right? So it's crisis management, and there's a lot of that. But I think, knowing what resources an organization has, having the communications, the investor relations team, the legal team, whatever the other consultants are, sort of participating in a process with the board, so they understand kind of what's there, and there can be a give and take, so you can plan ahead. We were talking about this in our prep call last week, but for a public company, the board's primary responsibility is to shareholders. So how do you help a board sort of, do that job well? And finally, it's one where the leadership of the organization, there's this symbiosis between the CEO, the GC, and the leadership team and the board. It's not an us versus them. We've been hired to work for boards separate and apart from management. And that's hard sometimes because not everyone's aligned. So those are the 3 things that sort of come to mind.
That's great. And the good news about that is that an attentive, talented board that's well engaged was kind of the common theme across all of that. So I think that's hopeful.
And the last thing is that since a lot of the folks on this call are probably from the Valley, who are constantly thinking ahead and changing the world and finding new technologies, what you want is a board that is willing to, I think Teresa and Amy talked about this, risk should be not just, I want to, do this rope-a-dope thing and hunker up, but it's how do I think about what's next? Look at what's happening in AI. And look at what's happening, a lot of these things, there is some really amazing things going on, and boards have to figure that out, and say, how do we invest and how do we support this innovation in a way that doesn't make people afraid to go to sleep at night when all these things might be happening. So I just wanted to share that as well.
You've queued up a great follow-up question, which actually was posed by someone listening in. And I love it when people ask questions that are tying together other webinars. So this is a question about Chevron deference, and I'm going to make it more specific. It says, hey, does that, what effect does these changes in the Chevron deference rules, not just local bright, but the other kind of cases that came before as well? What does that do to kind of risk tolerance, operational, legal risk? And so let me set it up this way. And we talked about this in the prior webinar, but let's not assume anyone followed that. And it goes something like, okay, so now arguably the administrative state doesn't get the presumption of correctness when litigating something in front of a court about, their interpretation of the law and the way they promulgated the regs. And so that should, in theory, give some empowerment to enterprises or players who are regulated entities. So what do you think? And Teresa, I'm going to start with you because you have operated in and out of like highly regulated entities for your whole career. What do you think changes, if anything, in terms of the risk framework or strategies that some players may have now that truly the calculus has to be different at some level, depending on how you think about it, now that the calculus is different for regulatory deference? What changes for a board?
Yeah, so I think part of it is that if you think about the decision, it's really about these situations where it's very unclear, right, what the law is, right? It's not clear that where the agency that is making this interpretation or this rule is really sort of out there a bit. Right. And that's the argument, right? That a court doesn't have to defer. They can say, well, we don't really believe Congress authorized you to make that interpretation. But yet, in order to do that, you're taking some risks. So if you decide you're going to do something different from what the agent, you're going to challenge an agency's rule, right? You've got the potential of having the ire of the agency and whatever may come from that, right? You've got the costs associated with that. So in my mind, it's got to be a big enough reason to sort of do that in order to sort of take the attendant risks that come with challenging the agency, because you're going to have to do that, because most of the time this is going to come up in an enforcement situation too, right? So it may not be sort of a proactive situation as much as it may be that you're doing something and the agency has an enforcement sort of focus. And then you do have maybe a bit more of an ability to go to a court and get some protection. So you can sort of think about it in that way as well. But I do think that companies should take that into account. The other interesting question that comes up with the whole Loper decision, Bright Loper, is that we have a lot of interpretations already that have been made that arguably could be overturned in a court case, but yet companies have spent millions of dollars already implementing those changes. And so to me, there's also this risk of what happens now that I've spent millions of dollars implementing a rule and someone comes in and challenges it. And now the court says, yeah, that rule, it doesn't apply anymore. Do I have to undo all of the spending I've done and go back? Is it optional going forward? That's a risk that I think is really hard to know what to do with, because you can't really control where it's going to come out.
And Dan, I can't tell you the number of meetings that I've been in with boards and management teams since the ruling came down, where people are using, oh, well, we have the it is now part of the calculus, and it's almost a talking point in any sort of dispute or messaging discussion, because it changes the landscape, and it is. So it's not just like it's not just a change in the way I think boards are thinking about it, the way Teresa described, but it becomes almost like a tool in any sort of engagement Because if you're trying to influence stakeholders on a certain issue, this interjects a level of uncertainty into an authority that had been previously sort of unassailable in some ways. And you look at any regulated industry in the last, 9 months since this ruling came out, you see a lot of this, which is where the board needs to sort of also be engaged on, right? To sort of understand all that.
And it may be more at an industry level, right? Because if you think about it, I think a lot of agencies, the SEC being one of them, has kind of gone back and looked at some of what was on their agenda in light of whether or not there was likely to be some type of challenge to it, right? And that's where I think engaging and the board looking for management to engage with industry trade associations to say to an agency, hey, we think this doesn't pass muster, right? Under the new ruling, Supreme Court ruling, is a way to address some of those things as well. But that's sort of trying to get in front of the issue before the rule has come out and now you've spent a lot of money implementing it.
So what's interesting about that is it sounds like this is a particular case of something that the board should be doing anyway, which is running cost benefit analysis around strategies and steps and risk taking. And so, the one component of risk taking is that you have a regulatory response you don't want. And now the calculation is a little different, but it's not, there shouldn't be anything brand new about kind of weighing these differences. I think there's a change to the equation, and so you maybe need to revisit it. But with that in mind, I want to swing to Amy and ask a very practical question, which is like you're on the board of Zora and a couple of others, and they are not financial institutions per se, but they're obviously intersecting and highly complex in many ways and enabling of financial institutions in some cases. What's your view? And I'm going to combine two topics, one of our questions and one that we just received. What's your view of non-financial institutions trying to institutionalize the handling of risk as a kind of siloed concept within management? So it is unusual to find non-financial institutions having a chief risk officer, and it's unusual to find a financial institution that doesn't have a chief risk officer. But, and here's the combination with our story. Chief risk officers, by and large, are meant to mitigate exogenous risks and risks related to the financial institution's operations at a oftentimes safety and soundness level, right? So it's a kind of don't do the thing that equals a bad thing, as opposed to strategic risk taking. In fact, a chief risk officer, by and large, would run the other way. If you said, "Oh, are you good at calibrating which risks to take?" They'd be like, "No, I'm about taking fewer risks." So Amy, what do you think about this idea of chief risk officers in the non-financial space? Good, bad? I mean, what might be this?
To me, well, my experience is that it's, in companies like Zora, there's a risk committee. But I'd answer it, it's sort of, to me, a similar question. Should one committee on the board own risk? To me, and my answer was the board should own risk oversight. To me, the executive team should own risk oversight, and having a risk committee, because risk transcends strategy, finance, legal, compliance, product, M&A, everything. You need a cross-functional team to be thinking about risk in an exhaustive manner. So I don't love the idea. I prefer that there's a risk committee. There's obviously somebody that has to head that committee and make it happen, but it should be to me, it's a team effort.
Yeah, but Dan, what if we redefined that title? So we get caught up in titles, chief risk officer, and we all have this immediate sense of what that is. But to Amy's point earlier, Teresa's point earlier, if part of the risk framework that companies and boards take out is to, I want to grow. Where should I be dedicating time and space and resources to product innovation? I want to expand internationally. Is that a good idea? What are the regulatory environments in different parts of the world? How do I do that? And, I've heard these executives be called chief growth officers or chief revenue officers or chief innovation officers. And so I think that risk has this really heavy feel to it. I can't take that risk, and for many good reasons. But from a articulation of strategy and all of that, I think that the idea of assessing risk or change or where to make the investment can be, branded, to use that word, in many different ways inside of boards. And so, like, I think that we almost, we put risk up on the corner over here, and that's, this team is going to look at it, and you can't breathe without checking in with these folks. But I do think that it's really something that, like, all boards need to kind of process, and leadership teams need to be kind of engaged in it.
So let me, in fact, okay, Amy, go ahead.
And yeah, I was just going to say one thing. Our head of legal asked me about 6 or 7 months ago if I would, because I'm on the audit committee of Zor, if I would take the NACD course on cybersecurity. And I did. One of the really interesting things that they talk about was how cybersecurity should not be a sort of just owned by the CISO, but cybersecurity should be baked into everything that we do. So when you develop a product, for example, you should be thinking about how you develop it to be, as protective as possible. And, when, et cetera, if you're on the talent team. And I think about, I've said this, but and we're talking about this, I think of risk as the same way, where it's sort of the air that we breathe, and it should be just baked into how we think about things. Ultimately at the top of the house, strategy is about choices, and choices have trade-offs, and inherent in those choices are thinking about risk. And so to me, isolating it feels risky in and of itself.
Yeah, and I think I was just going to say, I think that part of it is just in thinking about the business initiatives, to Elliot's point and Amy's point, thinking about business initiatives. I think it's up to the board to understand not only why do we think this is the right business initiative to take, but then what are the risks associated with it? What are the, and how are we managing those risks? How are we either going to comply if they're compliance risks? How are we going to mitigate potential risks? Is that something that the board should expect management to be able to discuss in asking to pursue some new business initiative? It just seems to be part and parcel of the discussion, not sort of sitting off to the side.
So let me tie that to the question that we received and kind of pick up this idea of risk taking. So I think one of the things you talked about a little while ago, it was what one might call future strategies for risk mitigation or damage control once something goes wrong. And so I want to kind of tie that back together, which is in most of the boardrooms I've been in, with the extreme exception of Google almost 2 decades ago, I've noticed that board members receive materials and discuss risk in lots of different ways. Sometimes they spend some time or a lot of time. Sometimes it's very visual, sometimes very technical. But one of the things I did not observe very often, except again in Google, was what, again, it might be a bias to finance and econ and like recovering Stanford professor problem, but this branching probability idea, right? So if you have things that, you're either going to succeed or you're not, and if you do succeed, then these things happen. If you don't succeed, then these other things happen. It seems like a board might want to take time to discuss when it goes wrong, here are the things that we can do to mitigate the impact, the consequences, turn it into something positive. So for example, if you launch a new product and you think it is not an insurance product or not a lending product, and you reasonably believe that, and you maybe a year ago, you wouldn't have launched it thinking that, but now you do because you calculate, if we get beaten up about this, we're going to be able to push back under this new reduction of deference under Chevron's new decisions. And you do that and you decide to do it. Well, it feels like part of that discussion in making that decision would be a very strong vetting of what does happen if, say, the state lending regulator shows up at our doorstep, or if we get sued by CFPB, like in a big way, if we're made an example of. It feels like that conversation, and someone like Elliot would be drawn in and say, okay, here's what we would do. We would rally political support. We would engage in a social media campaign to show all the good, tell me how that does or doesn't happen as a practical matter inside the boardroom, because what I just described sounds really great, but it also sounds extraordinarily time consuming for a board. So does the board engage in that kind of discussion about probabilistic futures and feel better because they have plans, or do you defer that completely to management and they just tell you we will have something to do if it all goes wrong, or is there some in between? So I think you each can contribute to that, but maybe I'm going to start with Amy. I wonder if you could talk about the fact that board time is constrained and you can't do that for 20 things. You would use up all your board meetings. So what's the strategy you would use?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to think that we could have that conversation in its fullest. And we don't, because we are constrained. I do think that, you know, the best boards spend much more time looking forward than talking about what happened. And I think that helps to free up the agenda to have those kinds of conversations. I also think, and this comes back to the similar, and as you think about cybersecurity, and cybersecurity, you talk about what are our crown jewels and like, what are the big things that could take us down? So you don't spend time talking about mitigating every risk. You spend time talking about the things, the smaller set of things that could really take it sideways. And that makes the conversation more manageable. And I think if management comes prepared to say, hey, you know, we're launching this new product. This is what the risks of it are, the big risks that, you know, that we can think about. Here's how we're mitigating it. And here's how we're going to track this on a, whatever it is, daily, weekly, quarterly basis and report back to you. That's the probably best way for that to happen. I think when you start to do scenario planning for everything big or small that could go wrong, it's just, that would be overwhelming. So for me,
let me just still add two like very specific takeaway points, because I think that was fantastic. One is, if you're always looking backward, meaning getting reports on what happened, like, you know, this last quarter we did, and then, you know, we had if you don't rebalance that with a emphasis on looking forward, then you've really missed an opportunity for a board. I think just as a framework of thinking as a board member, that is great. And then once you've done that, it really is all about choices, and it's about choices of consequence. So the bigger, the more impactful makes sense to spend time on, and not, you know, the operational. What if they don't like our product? What if we've picked the wrong PR firm? What if, you know, in Arkansas it doesn't go as well as we want? Okay, no. The question is, if CFPB shows up to make a big national example of us, okay, that one maybe just more time. So I love that framework. I think that's a really great way to look at it. Elliot and Teresa, did you want to throw in a little bit?
I agree with Amy. I always agree with Amy and Teresa. And full disclosure, I worked for Teresa for a while she was the CEO of the Federal Home Loan Bank in San Francisco, and we were in it. We had banks failing under, you know, in the world, and Teresa exhibited tremendous leadership during that period of really showing up for the industry. You know, it was very difficult. We didn't know if we were going to have a real meltdown, you know, and if banks were going to fail more than the ones that failed. But I think what we did this red light, green light, yellow light thing, which sounds really dumb, you know, and you can call it whatever, but we were like assessing, you know, here are the things that could happen. Here's the prioritization, which is what Amy was really talking about there, you know, and we were going through it. I guess I'm less sympathetic, maybe because I'm the outside consultant to the board about time constraints. And I'm like, you know, shit is happening, pardon my French. And like, I don't think we should worry about, like, you know, this carefully, you know, sculpted agenda for a board meeting, if in fact we are really dealing with things that are material to the business. And the last thing I'll say is that I think that you can do a lot of, look, I don't know, does every board member read the board packet that is sent to them prior to the meeting? I would hope so, because I know that management teams spend a lot of time putting that together, you know, but I think a lot of information can be, you know, highlighted in the prep work, so that when you're in the meeting and when you bring in the experts, I mean, the last thing is that, like, I've had the opportunity both with Teresa's board and other boards to come in and do a 15-minute quick discussion. Here's what we're working on. Here are the issues. Any questions? And that in many ways kind of pushes you quickly through an issue, rather than it be this sort of a lot of paper being passed around without any conclusions. So
I was intrigued by the fact that the traditional best practices of, you know, great boards do tend to be the things you need to bring to bear for every hard problem. So, you know, risk management, You should have well-prepared board members, materials that are designed correctly, and a board meeting which does not rehash what people could have read, and instead is a moving forward discussion built on top of that, right? Like, so I'm glad for you to say it, Elliot, but that's probably one of 3 or 4 good answers to every hard question every board ever faces, including this one. But Teresa, I want you to comment, then I'm going to come back and ask you a couple of follow-up questions.
So to the time constraint point, right? You can't focus on every issue. You want to be making sure that you're focusing on the big ones. And when I think about new products or new programs, the question is, are there things that could stop it? Right? I mean, there are risks, there are, there are other things that maybe it doesn't sell well. Those kinds of things are risks that you think about. How do we market it better? There are adjustments you can make. But there's some of them, when you talk about the CFPB or others, where there are ways to go about sort of trying to get in front of those issues to try to make sure that you are addressing them. I can think of a product a number of years ago where a company was putting a product out there that would have been a great product even today, but they put out a whole media blitz about the product. And they attracted the competitors that were going to be disintermediated in part to go on the attack with state agencies. And in that particular case, they got a state to shut the product down before they could get it launched. And they spent all this time and effort, et cetera, when to me, they would have been better off kind of getting all of the approvals and everything down before they even told anyone. To me, that was a risk of knowing that there were going to be players that you were going to affect that might try to use their own political power to shut you down, right? So I think thinking through those types of issues in the board, helping management think about those issues is important. The other thing is, because you can't know everything that's going to happen, you can't know. I mean, I think about being on a board during the beginning of the pandemic, right? It created a liquidity crisis for many businesses where warehouse lines weren't available, the cost of financing. And in that particular case, the board, we were meeting every week, sometimes more than once. And you just have to be prepared that those are situations where the board may need to, or some portion of the board may need to meet on a more frequent basis. But those are things that you couldn't predict in advance, right? But you have to be ready to step up if those things happen.
So let me jump in and follow. You set up a follow-up question that I wanted to ask perfectly, but I'll say that we have about 12 minutes left. Let's do this follow-up question, and then I'm going to shift to kind of more open-ended questions, which are kind of channeling some questions we're getting about risk-taking, and how boards should think about some opportunities that are intertwined with risk moving forward. So, but first, here's the follow-up, and there's a theme that can be observed, and there's some good academic work on this, but it shows up mainly in shareholder activism, and that is board and management burst capacity. What this means is, you might know people who are on several boards, they're a professional board member, and they're on 3, 4, or 5 boards. And that's getting a little harder to do these days for a variety of reasons, but it's all fine and well until maybe 2 of those boards have a crisis at the same time. That's when suddenly you feel overboarded, and you might actually be overboarded. So here's the question: what should boards and managements think about in terms of their availability and ability to expand their capacity and responsiveness when something happens, right? So the example you gave is a good one, Teresa. You have an event, and then it's all hands on deck. Elliot, you referred to it. Sometimes it's called, the board needs to shift gears. Sorry, it used to be a 300-hour-a-week job or 300-hour-a-year job, but for the next 6 months, it's going to be another extra 600 hours because we're in the middle of whatever. So how can boards and management think about that as laying the groundwork for being prepared to handle, events that, you took a risk and it panned out, badly, and now you need all this time? Is there a way to think about that, or is there a best practice? Because it's a problem, right? I mean,
I think it's in the nom-gov piece too, Dan. I mean, I'll just jump in there. It's like, and I don't like the traditional board that you check a bunch of boxes. You want a lot of diversity of opinions and experience and all that. You want a nonprofit, you want a bunch of, and that may still be good. And I don't build boards. There are people that are much more expert at this. Sometimes it's the CEO's best friends get to be on the board, and there's all that issues. But I think that in today's day and world where things do occur, things you can't even anticipate, like who knew the pandemic was going to happen? And so that's an exception. But with regulatory, with what we see in Washington, what we see with the FTC, what we see in a bunch of places, there's a lot more activism, I think, that comes at you from different places. And I think it's incumbent on management teams to make sure that they have the right board, the board that can really stand up and that's not going to say, well, I don't want to do this. I don't want to be part of this, that there's a willing partner in this. And I think that goes a long way. And I'll turn it over to the people that actually sit on boards
Amy, what's your experience in that? Like board members' capacity to suddenly expand their
It's tricky because we all as individual board members have to be stewards of our own time. And I can tell you, as somebody who sits on boards, that's what I do. I don't have a full-time operating role anymore. I don't sort of think about staffing myself for the normal capacity. It's like, you got to think about like, what if all of these boards actually were going through something at the same time, like we all doing. We all had a good reminder during the pandemic. And so, we're all hopefully professionals and we have to think about and manage our own time and know that this is it's our job and our responsibility. And if the board's going through a crisis, we got to step up and be there and help to lead it and manage it and mitigate it and all of that. Like, no excuses.
I would agree with that. No, I just agree with that. I don't think there's a way to sort of anticipate it in advance, except to understand that if that happens, then your responsibility as a board member is to step up. And that's what's expected, and that's what you need to do. And and think about that in terms of making sure that you've kind of got enough capacity, or that you can make the capacity if you need to.
Yeah, and Amy, you're a great example of someone who's, you sit on a handful of boards, but it's all you do, which means you have, the capacity to dedicate all of your professional time. I will plant a seed and observe that one of the challenges with, there's a strong preference generally for, sitting CEOs serving on boards. And if you don't pay attention to likely coincidental cyclicality for crises, then you might miss an opportunity to diversify. In other words, if your CEO, if the active CEO is on your board, is in a connected or adjacent industry that also experiences ups and downs with your industry at the same time, recognize that their attention is being demanded by their own enterprise. And when the dust settles, without commenting further, I think over the next year or two, as litigation plays out and everything plays out, we may observe that Silicon Valley Bank had a lot of directors who were, in my opinion, quite talented directors. I don't follow the critique that they didn't know what they were doing. I don't think that's true. But if you look at their own professional capacities, it was almost completely in sync with the ups and downs and demands of crises in time as Silicon Valley Bank itself, which poses its own challenge.
And Dan, I would just say that, for at least for most public companies, the executive chair role, the presiding director role, the lead independent director role can take on a very important public facing role alongside management. So it's not just CEO to the world, sometimes and we see this all the time. And I think they can be an incredible asset. Someone that's a lead independent director who can speak directly to shareholder issues, because that person's to shareholders, right? And many times they've got tremendous gravitas and great experience that can just be a nice 1-2 kind of partnership in terms of sharing. I know sometimes there's this idea that we don't want to put the board in the middle of stuff. We just want the CEO to be the key spokesperson. But I think in a risk environment where things are happening, I think, and we've done it, multiple times, bring in people that can actually, share their own experience. And I think it can be very valuable.
It's an interesting point. The exception does make the rule. You don't want management to be tripped up by board members who are overly engaged and not in their lane. But sometimes circumstances will demand a type of engagement from a board member in a very curated, purposeful way that does put them in the spotlight. And that's a consideration in kind of recruitment, retention, succession of boards. Let's shift gears the last few minutes. Oh, Amy, go ahead.
Can I just say one thing? Because I thought we had an interesting conversation when we were preparing for this that we haven't covered, and I thought it is a really important thing.
Go for it.
We were talking about creating a culture of risk-taking within the board.
That was my question. So that's my next, that's my next one. You take lead. No, you go. You know exactly what I'm about to ask. So you take lead. Go ahead.
So the idea that, because of Elliot, you made me think of it when you were talking about the board chair. I have seen boards where we are not having really what I would call courageous or difficult conversations that we should be having, whether it's around, do we do this big transformative M&A or not? Is it time for the CEO to find a new job or for us to find a new CEO or not? You know, all sorts of things, and where without the right board members, without the diversity of thought, and without the right chair, who is really key in eliciting these kinds of conversations, to have these kinds of difficult conversation, the board itself can create unnecessary risk. And so I just wanted to raise that, throw that out there as a piece of this that we hadn't discussed yet, that I think is a challenge and extraordinarily important.
And so, yeah, I'd love Elliot and Teresa in the few minutes we have left to maybe, Teresa, you go first, just comment on this idea of boards need to both internally embrace things that are uncomfortable and risky, but also need to encourage the strategic risk taking. And what is the right way, or what are some best practices for doing that? So we have some questions that go something like, you've got AI out there, and how do you tackle that? And there's other risks that present themselves. Again, a non-risk-taking enterprise, if you're a publicly traded company, that's all wrong. The reason I buy private equities is I can hold a diversified portfolio. I want you to take smart risks. I'm not buying treasuries. So what, Teresa, are some steps that a board can do to personify what Amy described in part?
So, part of it from my perspective is it's not just about getting the board materials and engaging in the board meetings. It's also about being educated about the main issues, and whether that's coming to webinars like this or participating in NACD. The big four accounting firms have great programs. There are a lot of ways that I think board members should be making sure that they understand what's out there, what are the big trends, because that's part of the benefit, right, of having this diverse board, to bring ideas and thoughts and ask questions about how are we addressing these types of issues. So to me, you want to come to the board as an educated board member, and then you want to create a culture where hopefully the lead director is helping to facilitate these discussions, but you should be facilitating a structure or culture on the board where any board member should feel comfortable raising an issue. I mean, I've been on a board before where there was a crisis. It was an exogenous issue that came up, right? But the question then became, is the CEO still the right CEO in this time? Or is this person sort of willing to sort of manage through this issue? And not everyone on the board was willing to sort of raise the issue, but it needed to be raised. So I think having that culture where board members feel comfortable, it can be done in a way that is respectful to the people who are involved and the other board members, but it's really important to raise those issues for discussion.
So let me jump in, and I'm going to ask, we have like 90 seconds left. And so I'm going to ask Elliot, and then Teresa, and then Amy, in that order. Tell us one thing that you hope people on this webinar will do next to improve their ability to think about, manage, or otherwise set, risk frameworks for their board. So just a 1 to do. It can be a do this, read this, think about that, whatever you want. You go first.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure about do or read, but I would just put out there that risk isn't evil. It's not a bad thing. It's how enterprises kind of move forward. But what Teresa was talking about, being educated, being smart on it, and having an open line of communication with not only the management team, but the experts that support the company, whether it's because I was going to say in this answer to this last question that the best practice I can say is that we go in and sometimes we tell you what your competition is doing, which sometimes defrays fear. So those are the kind of things that I would suggest in my 14 seconds. So
That's great. All right, thanks, Teresa, and then Amy.
I would just sort of reiterate, spending some time understanding what the major risks are and opportunities are, and then making sure those are being discussed in the boardroom.
And Amy, you get final word.
Yeah, well, I think thinking about having a conversation about, do we have the right balance of focus on defensive and offensive risk baked into our overall strategy, and having really explicit conversations around that.
That's great. I always like it when there's some disagreement, but consistent themes. Engaged boards, proactive, risk, both offense, defense, take the time to deal with it and stay ahead of it. So I thank you so much for taking the time. We're out of time, but we appreciate you. And we look forward to seeing everyone else again in a future session. And thanks again to our panelists. Have a good day.
Thanks.
Thanks. Great to see you.
Everyone. Bye.